Well, thank you all for coming. My name is Catherine Larson. I'm a film student in the I'm a film student, and I will be presenting on the story of Alvin York, Life of a Peacemaker. And is it possible for a troublemaker turned pacifist from the backwoods of Tennessee to become one of the greatest heroes of World War I? I know it seems like a made-up story. It seems like that's just something that people make up, but it definitely happened, and it's the real-life story of Alvin York, which I will be telling you today. I first became interested in telling his story when I was, last year, right after I switched my major to film, I decided to re-listen to one of my favorite Adventures in Odyssey episodes from when I was a kid, because I'm an adult, but I still listen on a daily basis. Anyway, because it's great. And I was immediately sucked into his story in a new way, because as a filmmaker, one of my greatest passions is to tell stories that people wouldn't hear otherwise, and inspires them and makes them better people, but also is entertaining. Because he isn't a very well-known hero, and it's stated a lot of people say, oh, we don't know him very well, I just want to give a few brief biographical details about his life. So he was born in 1887 in the backwoods of Tennessee. He was raised in a Christian home, but fell away after the death of his father in 1911. And he was drafted into World War I. He attempted to file as a conscientious objector, but it was denied, and he would go on to become a decorated war hero. My primary research questions were, could a man's life story be turned into a film that would appeal to a modern audience? What life events were the most important to include, and what are the different methods for adapting a life story? To answer the first two questions, I used the Blake Snyder beat sheet, which is industry standard for screenwriters. You can see it here. And one thing that's really interesting about the Blake Snyder beat sheet is because it is standard, you can actually pretty much time any movie that you were to watch. You can see the minutes, basically the numbers here are the minutes in that it would happen, opening image, setup, theme stated, and you could basically time any movie that you would care to watch with this and it would line up. Anyway, so that's how I created an outline for the film, and also to determine what life events to include. And I believe that York's story is actually incredibly cinematic. It's very much a classic hero's journey, and I believe that given the proper structure, it could definitely appeal to a modern audience. And I believe that structure is nonlinear because it allows for more tension and action throughout the story. I was very heavily influenced by Greta Gerwig's Little Women and Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins when creating the structure, because both directors, in particular Greta Gerwig, used the characters' present timeline as the foundational story, and then they would have cuts and flashbacks to earlier events in their life, usually triggered by parallel events in the present life, and that's how we learned about their backstory. So with York's story, his time in the military would be the foundation, and then we would learn more about his conversion to Christianity, etc., through flashbacks. And I was also inspired by my reading of York's writings to make it a love story. Of course, we have the classic love story between York and his future wife, Gracie, but beyond that, we have the love he has for his country and his God that drove him to do everything that he did. And I think one reason why this could be really crucial to making it a good film is because if you make a successful film, because if you make a war film, a certain percentage of the population is going to show up. There's a reason why Hacksaw Ridge won Oscars, is very successful at the box office. But if you make it a love story and a historical drama with some war sequences in it, it makes it much more broadly accessible but to the general population, but never glosses over the reality of war, which is something I would never want to do, because I say this respectfully, there is a reason why we have the phrase war is hell, and we should never gloss over war. So for the rest of my presentation, I will be walking through the outline I've created for the film based on the Blake Snyder beat sheet, and this is how I'll be telling you the story of Alvin York. So with the first time we meet York in the film, it'll be target practice at a military camp, and there'll be a brief flashback to him as a young man doing target practice with his friends, and we learn that he's a sharpshooter. And by the time it's his turn to shoot, his captain's kind of rather frustrated because some of his men aren't doing very well. Some of York's fellow soldiers aren't doing very well, and he said, oh dear, well, I can't imagine the conscientious objector is going to do any better, and York surprises him by getting 2 bullseyes back to back. We have records that this did happen, and so he called him, and so York's commanding officer says, okay, we need to talk about this, what's going on? So he calls him into his office, and says, I'm confused because you say you're a conscientious objector, but you shoot like a veteran. What's going on? And York says, well, I'm just not keen on doing something the Bible says not to do, and the Bible says not to kill. So now we get into the themes stated, which is essentially what the character needs to learn and what we are going to learn through them in the film. And so York's commanding officers point him to scripture verses, they were Christians as well, that says sometimes one way to be a peacemaker is to fight for what's right, and you don't need hate to fight a war, you need love. And at the end of this conversation, York says, I wish I could get my bearings, I wish I could be home on my mountain, things always make more sense when I'm closer to God, I wish I could just think it over because I can't think straight. And his commanding officers say, well, because we believe that you can make a valuable contribution on behalf of your country, we're going to give you a pass for 10 days. You can go home and think it over. And if you come back and you still can't get your head around fighting, let us know, and we'll approve your exemption so you can get out. And so while York is going home, there will be a flashback to him as a young man where his father teaches him how to hunt. And then York's father passes away, and we're not sure of the circumstances of his death. And in my mind, it makes sense that people would have said Christian cliches at the funeral, and that could have, York is angry at God for taking his father, he's angry at how the Christians responded, and he's also just feeling a lot of pressure because he's the man of the house now. He has to take care of everything. And so he decides he turns to partying essentially to cope. Back in the present timeline, York arrives home, and the first place he goes is to his family's church. And there'll be another flashback to him becoming a Christian at a revival meeting. And he goes, then back in the present timeline, he goes to see his fiancée, Gracie. And then there is another flashback where we learn how they met. Essentially, they met before he was a Christian. And so even though she was interested in him or was attracted to him, and he was very attracted to her, she said, no, absolutely not. You're not a Christian. I can't have a relationship with you. This is not okay. But then after he became a Christian, he did pursue her, and she returned his affections. And he was about to ask her to marry him when he was drafted. And so he actually proposes to her at the train station. He basically says, will you wait for me until I get back? And she says yes. So back in the present timeline, York goes up on the mountain to pray, and it's hard to determine exactly how he came to the conclusion that he could fight with good conscience, but it's believed that verses like blessed are the peacemakers in the Beatitudes and love always protects in 1 Corinthians 13 were crucial to him making the decision. So once he makes the decision that he is called to fight, he goes back to tell Gracie about it. And he reminds her why he's fighting for her and for their future family, because his captain told him, remember, you have the freedoms you have because people fought for it. You have a responsibility to fight for your family. And she promises to pray for him every day, even if she doesn't like him going off to war. So York goes back to his camp, and he and his company are sent to France, the 82nd Division. And several smaller battles play out. York relies on God for his strength, even though he struggles to connect with his fellow soldiers at times and is also extremely homesick. Then we get into the midpoint of the film, which is basically where everything's great for the character. And York is promoted to corporal because his commanding officers recognize that even though he has dealing with some teasing from his fellow soldiers, he has a can-do attitude, and he's steady under fire and an excellent soldier. Shortly after this, York and his company were ordered to proceed to the Aragon Forest, where the heaviest fighting was taking place. And on September 26, 1918, they participate in the Battle of the Aragon Launches, and this was actually the very first battle of the campaign that would continue until Armistice Day on November 11th. And then during the battle, one of York's men, who is also a close friend, is killed by a bomb, and York is actually with him when it happens, and he starts to question why he's even alive because he was actually more exposed than his friend. And so York grieves his friend, and there'll be a flashback to York's childhood best friend dying in a bar fight. This is actually what compelled him to become a Christian, because as his mom says, well, having a friend die in your arms will change a man either for good or bad. And so York writes to Gracie, and he tells her about his friend and that he has decided to fight even harder because there's so much needless dying in war. And if fighting is what it takes to end this horrible war, then no one's going to fight harder than him. And then on October 8th, 1918, the Battle for the Decauville Railroad begins. And this was essentially, it's just what it sounds like, the goal of it was to capture the Decauville Railroad and cut the Germans off from their supplies, because that would be a huge step toward ending the war. And then, so essentially, the rest of the film, majority of the rest of the film will be dedicated to this war sequence. So the 82nd Division, which is York's division, have to cross a large funnel-shaped valley, and they are hit hard by machine gun fire, and they decide that the best thing, York and a few other squads make the decision that the best thing for them to do is for York to take 10 to 12 men. They'll circle around and they'll flank them from behind this machine gun nest, and the rest of the men will stay behind and draw fire for them. And that's what they do. So they get there and things are going really well until they literally run into a German medical unit. Including a major and a few other officers. And the Germans are so surprised, they actually just throw their hands up in the air and surrender, and their Americans are relieved, but then it turns out that it's actually a trap. There's a machine gun nest nearby, and pretty soon they're pinned down, and York is the only one left of the men that he took with him, and he says, I have to do something. So he decides to use the same trick that his father had taught him for hunting turkeys, which is shoot the turkey in the back first so the rest don't run off. And he is able to use that strategy to kill 20 Germans without missing a shot before the major that they had captured previously says, don't shoot anymore, I'll make them give up. And he orders all his men to surrender, and York takes the rest of the men back down to the Americans that he had left there drawing fire, and there were only 6 of them that had survived, so there's 7 of them total, and he says, we're taking them out alive. And his fellow soldiers say, are you crazy? That's a horrible idea. We're basically going to get captured ourselves. I'm not in the mood for prisoners. Let's just kill them. And York says, no, absolutely not. I don't want to kill for no reason. So they start to take them back, and they actually have to go straight through the German front lines, and while they're on their way back, they encounter another machine gun nest, and while they're all pinned down, York tells the German major, he says, either you surrender or we're all going to die, including your men, so you need to surrender. And so the major literally just tells all the men to surrender. He calls for surrender, and York brings his prisoner total up to 132 Germans. And he comes back to, York and his men arrive back at their camp unharmed, and York is immediately promoted to sergeant for his heroic efforts and what he had done. And the next day, they rejoin their company and capture the Decauville Railroad, which is a huge step toward ending the war. And, of course, it ends on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918. And I believe the famous quote is, the 11th day, the 11th hour. And York is celebrated as a war hero. He received the Medal of Honor and several other awards, but he just longed to go home and be with his fiancée. And then we get into, again, this is a film outline, so we get into the final image of the film, which York sits on his front steps and watches the sunrise. Gracie slips out to stand beside him. He reaches up his left hand, revealing that he has a wedding band on, and he pulls her down beside him, and they share a few words and a kiss before the credits roll. And this is just because, like I said, it's a love story. I'm a hopeless romantic. And one thing I love about the idea of this is if we could end with a wedding, we could do all those things, but this is so much more poignant, I would say, because it makes it about them. And that's really why he was fighting for her and their family. And York actually said, I don't want to be remembered as a war hero. I want to be remembered as a husband, a father, and someone who loved Christ. So that is the story of Alvin York, Life of a Peacemaker. And these are the sources that I used to create this presentation. And also, so I hope to make this into a film, as I've said, and I would like to I'll be calling it Impossible Dream, The War You Know, The Man You Don't, and it'll be coming to theaters in a few years after I graduate and get $100 million and get someone to give me $100 million and shoot it and all those things. So that's my story. Right. So, do you just, any questions?
I do.
Yes.
I really like how you weave in his Christian testimony
Yes.
and the topic of romance.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you were able to find or could find in your future project letters between the two.
Yes, that would be my goal. I believe there are letters. And if you look on the website about him, there are, he has like, or excuse me, in one of the books I use, they do have letters that they wrote. So I would do that. And of course, my goal, because his family is very active in keeping his story alive, I would not want to do this without consulting them and getting their approval, etc. I just wasn't able to get my hands on an actual copy of the diary.
As a side note, if you'll take a look at Dr. David Sneed's book, An American Soldier in World War I, that's really the centerpiece. It's the letters between a guy, an unknown to most people, George Brown,
Mm-hmm.
and his fiance. Have you had a chance to see that? Are you aware of that book?
Not specifically. I'm not I guess I'm very interested in American history, but I'm more of a topically based, or like a character based. So I haven't had a chance to look at it, but it sounds lovely. I would love to look at that.
It would give you a lot of good ideas about
Mm-hmm.
how to work it.
Yes, that would be very much. And like I said, it would just be. Also, I don't want her to be like the trophy wife or the trophy girlfriend, so I would want to make her part of his story because she definitely was. And they kept in contact, like they wrote letters back and forth, or he wrote to her. I'm guessing it was harder for her to write back to him because he was in France, he was traveling around. And then also the beautiful thing about York is we have military records, but we also have his journal. Like I would definitely take some of his dialogue right from the books, like his journal, like things that he said in his journal. I would try to work it into his dialogue.
Can you go back to the slide that had your references on it?
Yes, ma'am.
And then, how did these inform your research exactly? What did you lean on the most, maybe?
I would say I leaned on, hold on, I can see if I can see. I would say I definitely leaned on the top one the most, I believe, because that's where I got a lot of the information, like about the letters and specific dates, everything like that. I also, I believe I forgot to include in my search, but I did use information from the Sergeant York Historical Society or Sergeant York Memorial. I can't remember the top of it off the top of my head. It's been a long semester. And I did work on that, did use that quite a bit. And then when it came to some of the themes and things like that, like I would love dearly. I don't know how I would do it, but if I could, I'd actually love to get the. You can see D. Arnold as the Adventures in Odyssey. I'd love to get either Paul McCusker or Dave Arnold, who wrote the script for the Adventures in Odyssey episode, involved in the writing process. I know they have done that for historical films before, because then I could say, hey, if you want to basically just use a lot of the lines you use, because there's one line that gives me goosebumps, and this is the line that actually made me say, I want to do a movie about this, is his commanding officer tells him, when he's saying he's going to go home, he says, well, while you're there, remember York. This country wasn't given to us. We had to fight for it. Men like you, men of great faith, spilled their blood for it. And that's why you can live a free life. Don't you think your children deserve the same? And that line gives me goosebumps every single time I hear it. I'm like, I can't plagiarize, but I really want to use lines like that. So can you guys help me write the script? So that's kind of my goal, I would say. So I would say, and again, the Adventures in Odyssey was the inspiration for it. And I did reach out to them, and they were able to give me some more information, too.
And the project itself, is it going to be more documentary-based, or is it going to be more narrative, movie-like?
More movie-like, I would say, because we haven't really, there is a Sergeant York movie, but it was made quite a long time ago, and I know most people my age, unless you're incredible tool like I tend to be, you don't really want to watch black and white movies. So I don't know how many people would be interested in it. And I want to make a new film that would appeal to the modern generation. That's why I specifically said for a modern audience. And nonlinear storytelling is a very popular method. And again, that's why Christopher Nolan, his movie hasn't even come out, his next movie hasn't even come out yet, and it's already getting Oscar buzz. So people are already like, oh, I'm calling it, Oppenheimer's going to get Best Picture or be nominated. So I think nonlinear would be really helpful. It's just something makes it more interesting. So it would be more of a film, but it would be very historically accurate. Like I live by when it comes to films like this, I always, I take a lot of influence from, what they say when they are writing The Chosen, actually. He said, I can't remember if it's Dallas, the director, who specifically said it, but they said anything that's directly, we know for a fact happened in Scripture is behind a 10-foot barbed wire fence, we can't touch it. But if it's something that we aren't sure about, we can fill in details. So we don't actually know much about York and Gracie's relationship because his journal picked up right when he was getting ready to go. And they were already engaged at that point, or going to get engaged. So because of that, we can have a little more fun and say, oh, I think this could have happened. So that's kind of my goal.